So, good afternoon and welcome to the West Yorkshire Pension Fund annual meeting for members. The aim of the meeting today is to inform you about the performance and activities of the fund. So, West Yorkshire Pension Fund is one of the largest of the 86 pension funds that comprise the local government pension scheme in England and Wales. At the accounting year end of 31st of March 2023, West Yorkshire Fund had almost 320,000 members and 394 employers. The largest employers in the fund are the 5 West Yorkshire councils: Bradford, Coaldale, Kirklees, Leeds and Wakefield. The local government pension scheme is Local Government Pension Scheme and the West Yorkshire Fund is a defined benefit pension scheme. This means that the pension you get is based on your salary and how long you pay into the scheme. Your pension is not determined by how well investments perform. The scheme provides secure and guaranteed income every year when you stop working. The LGPS is the largest defined benefit scheme in England and Wales and one of the largest in the world. So whilst investment performance does not determine the pension that members on a defined benefit scheme get, it does underpin the finances of the scheme. So it's kind of worth mentioning at that point what that means and what West Yorkshire's position is. At the completion of the 2022 triennial actuarial valuation, West Yorkshire's funding level, the ratio of its assets to its liabilities, increased to 108%. And this included an additional allowance in liabilities to reflect a significant increase in inflation expectations since the valuation date. For the year ended 31st of March this year, the West Yorkshire Pension Fund delivered a positive return, despite 2022 and 2023 being a more challenging year for global investment markets than the preceding 2 years. And at the end of that period, the value of the fund had assets valued at £17.95 billion. Early indications suggest that West Yorkshire Pension Fund's 2022-23 investment return of 0.6% is one of the highest within the local government scheme, and the fund's longer-term returns also compare favourably against the LGPS average. The changing investment market conditions coincided with the completion of the triennial valuation process and provided a timely opportunity for the fund to review its strategic asset allocation and update its investment strategy statement, all of which is now ongoing. So during 2022-23, the fund has taken on new management. Euan Miller, to my left, has joined West Yorkshire as managing director of the fund, and Leandros Kalisperas has joined as Chief Investment Officer, leading an investment team that is the largest in-house fiduciary manager in the LGPS scheme. You will hear from them both shortly. If investments and assets are one side of the fund, the pensions administration is the other. In addition to providing administration services for the fund's almost 320,000 members, West Yorkshire also provides a shared service administration to 3 other LGPS funds and 23 fire and rescue authorities, over 500,000 members in all. The West Yorkshire Fund Administration Service continues to perform to a very high standard in an increasingly challenging environment. And during the forthcoming year, the fund expects to implement the much talked about cloud remedy and is making excellent progress in preparing for the launch of pension dashboards. In conclusion, I'd say West Yorkshire Pension Fund remains both well-funded and well-run. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Euan Miller, who's Managing Director of the fund, who will present a more detailed view of the operation of the fund.
Thank you, Councillor Thornton, and good afternoon to West Yorkshire Pension Fund members joining us. I'm going to be the first of 3 speakers this afternoon. I think we'll both speak for about half an hour. I'm going to give a general update on West Yorkshire Pension Fund's activities over the year. Our new Chief Investment Officer, Leandros, is going to talk about investments specifically. And Philip Hebson, who's one of our external investment advisors, will give his take on investments also in some wider political matters. I am, of course, new to the fund, or relatively new. I've actually been here for nearly 1 year now. My first job actually at West Yorkshire Pension Fund was attending this meeting last year, so it's kind of nice. I've seen the full cycle now. I replaced Rodney Barton, who many of you will remember, who was in post for a number of years before myself. I'm not entirely new to the LGPS. I did work at Greater Manchester Pension Fund for 9 years before coming across to West Yorkshire. And prior to that, I was a pensions actuary. So that's kind of my background. Talk through some key issues. I think the presentations today cover a range of issues, both local, national and global, which will have an impact on the fund. All three presentations notably talk about inflation to a certain extent, which has clearly been a big issue both in the UK and most nations. I'd say most of my presentation focuses on local WYPF matters, such as our administration service and the fund's financial health. I point out on this slide, whilst this is about West Yorkshire Pension Fund, it's an AGM for West Yorkshire Pension Fund, we do the administration for a number of other schemes. So we administer more than half of the UK fire authorities. These are the firemen's pension schemes, firefighters' pension schemes, and 3 other LGPS funds, Lincolnshire, Hounslow and Barnet. Councillor Thornton mentioned our relatively healthy funding position. We're kind of in the middle of the valuation process at the moment. So the sort of gap between valuations. So the last valuation was an effective date of 31st of March 2022. New contribution rates came in from 1 April 2023. We've just gone past that sort of 18-month point between the 3 yearly valuation cycles. So our next valuation will be in 2025. I don't actually talk a great deal about the valuation in my slides. It's kind of nice to have a year off talking about valuations. I focus on our value for money. It's obviously imperative that we continue to deliver value for money, and West Yorkshire Pension Fund has a very proud history of being relatively low cost and delivering value for members. I will pass over, after talking about these things, to Leandros, our new Chief Investment Officer. One thing I think it's very important to point out, in years gone by, we'd have likely held this meeting when the West Yorkshire Pension Fund accounts have been finalised and our annual report is ready to be published. We're not in that position this year, unfortunately, but it's not anything directly to do with the pension fund. As many members online will know, there's been material delays in many local authorities finalising their accounts. Still for 21-22 year, a lot of councils haven't finalised their accounts. Complicated matters which I won't go into here, but issues with the auditors signing off things like street furniture, culverts and these sorts of things. Nothing to do with the pension fund at all. But unfortunately, we can't finalise the pension fund accounts until our relevant council, which is Bradford Council in this case, finalises their accounts. And then the fact that the 21-22 accounts aren't finalised means there are some delays to 22-23. We have had our audit largely complete for the pension funds 23 audit. We will be publishing by the 1st of December the 2023 annual report. We published last year's by the 1st of December 2022, even though it hadn't been signed off. I think the key point to remember here is that West Yorkshire Pension Fund is not a legal entity in its own right. It is a part of Bradford Council. For example, all the staff at West Yorkshire Pension Fund are technically employed by Bradford Council. All the fixed assets are owned by Bradford Council. The fund can own investments and does own around £18 billion of investments, but anything that isn't an investment needs to be owned by Bradford Council, and we are allowed to use it. So things like the desk and the chair that I'm sat on are technically Bradford Council assets because they're not counted as investments. So going back on this point, I'll give a sort of background of how Bradford has come to be the administering authority for West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So local government pensions as we know them today started back in about 1974 So there was a local government restructuring in 1974, created a map very similar to the one on the left, which translates broadly to each of the LGPS funds. I'm not sure Wales is quite right. There definitely isn't an Anglesey pension fund, and I think there's a Cardiff and a Swansea, but England, I think, on this map corresponds with what we know in the LGPS today. Point of detail, which the map doesn't show, is there are 32 London boroughs who've each got their own pension fund. There's also a couple of others like the London Pension Fund Authority and the Environment Agency. But broadly, that map you can see there are the various LGPS funds. The LGPS is technically a single scheme in England and Wales, but it's administered on a local basis. The Scottish and Northern Irish are separate schemes. Benefits are very similar to the English scheme, but slightly different. They're separate schemes. There's about 10 to 15 funds in Scotland, and there's only one single fund in Northern Ireland. England and Wales, there used to be about 89 or 90 when I first came into the LGPS, but I think we're down to about 86 now through a merger process. Specifically about West Yorkshire Pension Fund, the fund as we know it today would have been created in 1974. I forget the exact title of the body, but there would have been a sort of West Yorkshire local government body which existed from 1974 till about 1987, which would have been administering authority for the pension fund. The pension fund was based in Wakefield in those days. And then in a further local government restructuring that took place in 1987, the metropolitan councils were abolished at that time. And some of the functions they used to do went to some of the individual metropolitan councils. So Greater Manchester, it was Tameside got the pension fund. In Merseyside, Wirral got the pension fund. And in West Yorkshire, Bradford got the pension fund. So West Yorkshire Pension Fund moved across to Bradford at that time. So Bradford Council, if you went into the LGPS regulations, in an appendix at the back, Bradford Council would be named as the administering authority for the West Yorkshire area for local government pensions. And the key point is administering authorities have a legal duty to put in place governance arrangements to administer their regional fund. So it's a responsibility of Bradford Council to ensure that West Yorkshire Pension Fund is appropriately run. Some key facts and figures. Assets are very nearly 18 billion. Since myself and Leandros joined, there's been remarkable stability in our assets. There's been ups and downs, but I don't think at any point that I'm aware of, it's either gone above 18.5 billion or below 17.5 billion. So sort of reassuring level of stability on the assets over the last year or so. In terms of employers contributing to the scheme, we have 394 of those at the end of the financial year. For many, many years, employer numbers were increasing in the LGPS, but certainly in West Yorkshire Pension Fund and perhaps more widely, they've actually started to plateau and even fall. I'll come on to describe the reasons I think are behind this. Membership is currently 319,484. That was at the end of the financial year. And I mentioned earlier that we do administration for a range of other funds. If we take those members into account, we're actually doing the pension administration for slightly over 500,000 members, which is a phenomenal number. So a little bit of fun. Illustrate what a huge undertaking it is administering a scheme of this size. There are actually 23 countries in the world that have less people than we have members of West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So we've got slightly more members than there are people in Vanuatu, but less members than there are people in the Maldives. If we took into account those shared service administration members, which gets us up to 500,000, there is another 6 countries that would be bigger than. So Maldives, Iceland, Bahamas, Belize, Brunei, and Cape Verde. I don't know what population growth is like in Malta, but at some point in time, Malta may get overtaken as well. So a little bit of fun. This chart shows the various types of member. So active members are members who are contributing to the scheme and their employers are contributing to the scheme on their behalf. Pensioner members are members who are drawing benefits from the scheme, and the deferred members are in between. So the members that are no longer contributing to the scheme, no longer earning benefits, but their pension hasn't gone into payment yet. And the 3 bars are the 2006 figures, and then the last 2 years, 2022 and 2023. General trend, I would say, is that active membership numbers are relatively flat. I think we had a reasonable year in actually increasing active membership last year, but generally broadly flat, the active membership figures, but deferreds and pensioners are increasing quite quickly. Pension funds generally like having more active members than they have pensioners, because it makes things easier from an investment perspective. I think if we have new money coming into the fund, we're in a better position than most LGPS funds on these statistics. For one reason or another, I think there's probably been less outsourcing in West Yorkshire public services than there has been in many other regions, which has meant our active membership numbers have been relatively healthy. It's important to point out, whilst I say we've got about 320,000 members of the fund, there could be members who've got more than one record. It is possible to have an active record and a deferred record. Also possible to have 2 or more active records if you have 2 or more jobs. So it's not a precise science, these membership numbers. In terms of employers, wide range of employers in the fund. They break down broadly into 2 categories. So we have what's known as scheduled bodies. So these are employers that are required to offer membership of the LGPS to their staff. This is where they're not eligible for another public service pension scheme. So, for example, in academy trusts and FE colleges, the teachers would be in the teachers' pension scheme. Non-teaching staff would be offered membership of the LGPS. Some universities fall into the scheduled bodies camp. The universities created in 1992, I think, are in this group. Other universities are what we call admission bodies. So admission bodies sign what's called an admission agreement to join the fund, and it sets out their terms of being an employer in the fund. But whilst it's complicated due to things like TUPE and various employment law and the terms that would leave on, these employers can leave the fund if they wish to do so, these admission bodies. Typical admission bodies would be things like cleaning or catering contractors, perhaps in academy schools, perhaps to local authorities. They're what we call outsourced service providers. We have charities in the fund. We have housing associations in the fund. And as I mentioned, some universities. So those are the 2 groups, scheduled bodies and admission bodies. A lot of those 282 scheduled bodies that we had contributing over the year will be academy schools. I haven't got the year-end figure at March 2022, but we know that 443 employers paid into the scheme or the fund at some point during 2023 financial year. This was 20 less than in the year before. I think part of the reason for this is how we treat the academy trusts. Legally, the trust is the employer, but sometimes LGPF as funds have almost administered it as if individual schools were separate employers. So one thing we're looking to do is treat these academy trusts as the employers. This is something that a lot of LGPS funds have been looking at. I think there's actually been less outsourcing as well over the last year or 2. I think contracts are coming to the end, and the bodies that awarded these contracts have sometimes been deciding not to relet the contracts. So that's another reason I think our employers' numbers might have dipped slightly. Important to note that the headline figures of 18 billion of assets and membership numbers sort of hide some of the complexity. Each employer's effectively got a sort of notional section of the fund, and we track individual funding positions as well. And each employer will have its own cash flow position. There will be employers that only have 1 active member and 20 pensioners, for example, or employers that have relatively recently joined the fund might have no deferred and pensioner members and a handful of active members. So there's a lot of sort of diversity amongst the employer base, and employers can have different objectives and different needs. So it's a kind of hidden level of complexity that exists there that we need to manage. I'm not going to say a great deal about assets. I'll let Leandros talk about assets. Only to note, as the chairman did in his introduction, that we got a small positive return in the last financial year. You'll notice that the actual amount of assets has gone down slightly, but that's because pensions paid are actually higher than contributions in these days. To stand still, we need to make a positive investment return. I think this small positive return is actually a really good result, because it was a year where we saw interest rates increase significantly, which tends to reduce capital values of assets. So to get that positive return, I think, was a really good achievement. Another little bit of fun fact is that there's an annual survey of the world's largest pension funds, and West Yorkshire Pension Fund currently ranks at 241st in this survey in terms of asset size. We were 269th the year before. If the LGPS were counted as a single scheme, which legally it is, it would certainly be in the top 20 globally. I would guess it might be around 10th in this list, but the study treats each fund as an individual arrangement. Inflation. I think it's going to be mentioned in three contexts today. I'm mentioning it in the context of pension increases. So one of the great things about the LGPS is all the benefits are linked to inflation to protect the purchasing power of the pensions. It's the consumer price index is the inflation index used. And the pension increases take effect in April. Technically, they take effect, I think, on the first Monday after the end of the tax year. So it's usually about the 9th or 10th of April, that sort of time of year. And the pension increase is generally in accordance with the previous September's CPI figure. I say generally because I think there's different types of benefits. There's pensions in payment, the pensioners increase, career average benefits that members have built up since 2014 get an annual increase, and also deferred benefits pre-2014 get a CPI related increase as well. I think the pensioners increase is pretty much set in stone. The career average benefit increase, I think, needs the Chancellor or somebody similar in government to authorise it. But in every year I've known in the LGPS, it has always been equivalent to that September CPI figure. So I don't think it's something to worry about greatly. The September CPI figure for this year came out about a week ago and was 6.7%. So still high inflation, but lower than the 10.1% that we saw last year. So all else being well, and I'd be very surprised if it wasn't the case, all benefit categories should get a 6.7% increase next April. And that will obviously have implications for the fund. Moving on to some of the accounting figures that will appear in the annual report and the accounts when they're finalised. This slide sets out contributions that we get in. I'm going to go into more detail of that on a next slide. Benefits payable. You'll notice there's a gap. So in the year to 2023, the benefits payable were about 70 million higher than the contributions received. In addition, we paid about 13.5 million of admin expenses. So we were sort of cash flow negative to the tune of about 85 million. This will be a lot higher in 23-24 because I mentioned a few minutes ago there was a 10.1% pension increase applied last April. So you could be looking at that benefits payable figure up certainly over 700 million, maybe about 730, 740 million. On any given year, we tend to have more retirees than we have deaths as well. The pension numbers increase. So you get a bit of an increase in the benefits payable through there. So this gap between contributions and benefits will widen, could be up at about 130, 140 million in 2024. But you'll notice the line 5 down, investment and other income, nearly 495 million in 2023 and probably will be over 500 million this year. So that means when that's taken into account, we've got absolutely no trouble at the moment, thankfully, paying the members the pension. So we've got sort of 400 million of liquidity effectively a year, which is very useful. Picture's a little bit more complicated. We have commitments to private market assets and these sorts of things that we need to meet. But we're in a reasonable position there. We are in a better position in terms of cash flow than many other LGPS funds, which is helpful. I mentioned earlier the sort of membership profile is not bad here compared to some other funds. And also, I think our investment strategy is quite good in terms of yield. We've got quite a high UK equity allocation, which is high yielding, and some other high yielding assets as well. Picking up again another point I mentioned around the return. So the terms of change in market value, that was a sort of capital return on our investments last year. That was negative to the tune of 436 million, but this was more than cancelled out by the investment income of 495 million. So it was a little bit more challenging year from an investment perspective last year, but this came off the back of 2 really good years. You'll see the figures to the right there, 1.3 billion and 2.8 billion with a capital return in the 2 previous years. In terms of contributions, they come from 2 sources, employers and employees. Employees' contributions, they're on a sort of salary related scale. So I think the very highest earners in the LGPS pay member contributions of 12.5%. I think the lower earners pay about 5% contributions, and there's a sliding scale with lots of bands in between. Employers typically pay around 15 to 20% of pay, but it depends on the type of employer and their individual funded position, whether there's a deficit or surplus in their section of the fund. The items at the bottom of the slide, other is largely transfer values received over the year. So we've got about 37 million pounds of those. And non-statutory pensions, these were historically sort of augmentations awarded to members. The current regulations don't allow employers to do that method. So you'll notice that figure is tending to fall over time because no new pensions coming into payment. This slide shows the benefits payable. You'll notice that non-statutory pensions exactly cancels out. This is because these aren't funded benefits. They're pensions that are recharged to employers. Other is the transfer values that go out, very similar number to the transfer values we receive. And then the top two figures are the pensions and lump sums. So this is the benefit outgo. Lump sums is hard to predict. This is when the member retires and part of their benefits is taken as a tax-free lump sum. Around the time of COVID, 2020 was probably a relatively high figure because we experienced quite a lot of retirements around that time. The pensions figure, that's the sort of monthly pensions payroll, which is a little bit harder to predict from year to year. As you'll notice, the general trend is upwards, and it will be quite steeply upwards, given where the inflation figures have been for the last couple of years. Administration expenses, so these are millions. So total management expense over the year was 13.6 million. We're required to break this down into three categories. This is the sort of local government accounting body SITFA sets guidelines that we need to follow when preparing our accounts. So we split this into three categories: pensions and administration, investment management, and oversight and governance. Quite a big increase from 2022 to 2023. Part of that will be general inflation. Increase in membership numbers means we need more staff here to administer the scheme. And we're also sort of planning ahead to a certain extent in some areas, in particular IT spend. So we're trying to sort of increase the amount of things we do digitally, which will save us money in the long term. And we're also preparing for some big administration challenges that we will face. McLeod and the pensions dashboard in particular, which I'll come on to talk about shortly. Whilst costs are a little bit higher than they were the previous year, we are still very, very competitive against our LGPS peers. Our overall costs are actually the lowest in the LGPS. Can be difficult to compare investment management costs because obviously every LGPS fund has its own investment strategy. Some investment strategies, some asset classes are more expensive than others. That's natural. So it can be quite hard to compare apples with apples there. What I think is easier to compare is the administration costs and the oversight and governance costs. How cost efficient you are. We're talking sort of pounds per member here as well on this slide. And it's important to note these are 2022 figures rather than 2023. That's because the benchmarking information for 2023 hasn't been released yet. But it should roughly correspond with how big a fund you are. The biggest funds should be the most efficient in terms of pounds spent per member. And we're around the third biggest fund in England and Wales, so seeing our admin spend of about third is reassuring. You maybe don't want to be the lowest cost on administration because it might suggest that you provide a less all-encompassing service. It's very much focusing on value for money, but I think it's broadly reassuring that we are one of the lowest costs in that area. Leandros will talk about benchmarking investment performance. Whilst it's complicated, the numbers sort of speak to themselves in terms of investment performance. They are what they are. What is really difficult is to know whether you're doing a good job of administration. Anecdotally, you can kind of sense whether you run a good service or not. But it's quite difficult to sort of be objective about it because each fund is responsible for sort of setting their own targets for administration. We set some key performance indicators. These are set out in full in the annual report. I can't remember exactly how many KPIs we've got, but it might be about 30 or so. We try and set ourselves relatively stretching targets. So for each task, we decide how many days that we would like to complete this task in, and then we measure our success rate against this target. They're designed to be challenging. I think if you were meeting all your KPIs all of the time, your KPIs probably wouldn't be stretching enough. So it's finding a balance between what's stretching and what's achievable. The most important thing we do in the administration side is paying the pensioners on time, which I'm pleased to see we've got 100% compliance with. And also when members unfortunately experience deaths, processing the deaths quickly and putting pensions in place and other benefits to beneficiaries is very, very important. We've got a big team here and we need to move resource around at various times. We get busy times of year. The areas which are probably less time sensitive, one of them I show here is pension estimates. And the other one is when a member leaves active service, becomes a deferred member, they get a deferred benefit statement. They are the less sort of time critical tasks. And if we do need to move resources around, it's those areas where the KPIs can suffer a little bit. So you'll see the estimate KPI is at 78% there. But the key requirement is paying the pensions on time. Quickly mention pensions tax. So this was a change announced in the March budget by the Chancellor. This will affect active members. It won't affect pensioners. The annual allowance, which is how much benefits, the capital value of benefits you can build up each year without being subject to additional tax charges. That was raised from 40,000 to 60,000. Some of the higher earners in the fund had stopped paying ABCs in previous years because they might breach this annual allowance. That's become more of an option to these members, which makes a change. And also the Chancellor abolished the lifetime allowance as well. It still technically exists until an act goes through Parliament, I think. So at the moment it exists, but we don't apply it. And when I heard of this change, I thought this is great. This is actually the first time that I've worked in the LGPS and I've heard a policy announcement that should actually simplify our administration a little bit. But I believe the nitty gritty of how it's been applied is actually more complex than it seems at face value. There's also quite a technical point at the bottom around the date that our care benefits are revalued. There was a strange sort of problem that we had for a while where HMRC rules about how they take into account inflationary increases in benefits didn't match up with how the LGPS worked in practice. So I'm pleased to see that this got resolved as well, which has simplified things. A couple of big administration challenges. The McLeod remedy, some members may be aware of. It's been talked about a lot for a number of years. This issue when they changed the benefits from final salary to career average in 2014, and they changed the retirement age as well. They put in place protections for members who were closer to retirement at that time, and it subsequently got ruled in the court that this was age discriminatory. So there's been appeals and many years of wrangling, but we finally got to the point where we have got regulations laid. These came into effect from the 1st of October. So LGPS funds can now go away and do the McLeod remedy. So a lot of calculations, new retirements can sort of be compliant with these McLeod regulations. We will need to go back and rectify some members that may have been underpaid over the years. I think there'll be very few members impacted in practice. It's more a big administration exercise than it is something that will materially affect members. And the second thing I mentioned on this slide is pensions dashboards. Not an LGPS specific thing, going to apply across the whole of the pension industry. This is infrastructure to allow members to see all their pension benefits in one place. There's already been a bit of a pushback on the deadline back to 2026. We can connect to this dashboard infrastructure early if we want to do so. And I think we're making really good progress in this area. I think we've done as much as we can in terms of dashboards. So I feel relatively comfortable in this space. I think it'll be interesting to see what impact dashboards have. We might be inundated our helpline by calls when these dashboards come in, because suddenly it gets a lot of press at the time as well. Everybody will be going on and checking their pensions, but it could be really positive in the long term, I think, is in terms of improving funds data. We're reliant to a certain extent on members telling us things. So I think dashboards will sort of help that information flow, I think. Final thing I was going to talk about is governance arrangements. I mentioned before that Bradford Council is responsible for the government arrangements of West Yorkshire Pension Fund. Best practice to do a governance review in any case. I think myself and Leandros coming on board has meant the timing's been quite good. So this is something we're working on at the moment. The diagram you can see in front of you there is our current governance arrangements. So we have two groups, the Investment Advisory Panel and the Joint Advisory Group. Investment Advisory Panel makes investment recommendations. Joint Advisory Group makes administration, finance related recommendations. These recommendations are taken to the Governance and Audit Committee to approve. Governance and Audit Committee is a Bradford Council committee, whereas there's a representation from a range of employers on the Investment Advisory Panel and the Joint Advisory Group. There's also trade union representation as well. There's also something called a local pension board. This is something that all LGPS funds are required to have. It's kind of a scrutiny body. It's not a decision-making body. If it doesn't like the way the investment advisory panel or joint advisory group has gone about making a decision, it can mention this to Bradford Council, and it can report to the pensions regulator as well. So it's a kind of full review we're taking stock of here. How often are these the right committees to have? Do they meet the right amount of times? Are there the right number of members on there? So we're very much open to suggestions on this one, and we've got some professional advisors working with us on it. So I think this will be the results of this will be announced some point next year, probably shortly after the end of the financial year. I've finally got a slide with a couple of key messages. Want to reinforce the message that pensions are set by regulation, not affected by movements in the stock market, investment returns, or changes to the LGPS. Pensions likely to increase by 6.7% in April 2024. And I feel West Yorkshire Pension Fund is in a very sound financial position. We've got positive cash flow, as I explained, and also a surplus of assets over liabilities at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that, Euan. We have we've received a number of questions from members that were submitted in advance, so we're going to try and answer those kind of at the point at which the relevant section's been covered. So question one that's come in is, government announced that the earliest age you can take your pension will increase from 55 to 57 from the 6th of April 2028. And it says, I'm not happy with this. How can this be right? And I think it should emphasise it's the age at which you can take your LGPS pension.
Yeah, we're still waiting to see a lot of the details of this. I think it was first trailed about a year ago that government was looking at increasing the minimum pension age. I think there will be some sort of transitionary arrangements. So, for example, anybody that's joined the scheme by a certain point in time will be able to keep the minimum pension age of 55. I think government many years ago announced an intention that the minimum pension age should be 10 years behind the state pension age, and this announcement is in keeping with that policy. But my instinct is that anybody who's on this call today who will be a member of the fund shouldn't be impacted by this, because I think we hope there'll be some sort of transitional arrangements which keeps it at 55 for current members.
Okay, and the next question was that we've seen that a number of councils are in serious financial difficulties, with some declaring themselves unable to meet liabilities. How does this affect the wider scheme and the local fund and its ability to maintain its index-linked pension commitments?
Okay, first point to note, I think, is that the scheme assets, whilst we're part of Bradford Council, the scheme assets are ring-fenced from those of Bradford Council. So the sort of solvency of Bradford Council doesn't have a direct impact on West Yorkshire Pension Fund. As we both mentioned before, we're in a relatively well-funded position. Our funding level is 108% at the last valuation. It has probably marginally improved, if anything, since that date. So we're in a position where we've got the money to pay the benefits, and we will do for the foreseeable future. Obviously, there is financial difficulties within councils. There's been some high-profile councils that have got into financial difficulty. Birmingham was probably the most high-profile 2 months ago or so. To the best of my knowledge, there's been no direct impact on their local LGPS schemes. I don't think Birmingham Council defaulted on their contributions to West Midlands Pension Fund, for example, and I'm sure that there's no question of beneficiaries of West Midlands Pension Fund being impacted anyway by Birmingham's insolvency. So I'm relatively relaxed that the sort of controls that are in place means that members shouldn't have any concerns in this area.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Euan. And now move on